So I would like to invite Irvin. Bring it home, please.
All right. Thank you, Lourdes, for creating this kitchen ambiance. And you introduced me initially by saying I'm a professor of this and that. And I think for today, it's not important who I am, but whose I am, as Bishop Desmond Tutu reminds us. And so, of course, today I'm with you and Mimi and Roxanne and with our many participants. And I'm humbled and honored to be in that capacity. So I want to share with you very humbly an approach that we call the positive deviance approach, an approach that I've been working with for about 17 years in dozens of communities, in dozens of countries, on pretty much all continents, including here in the border area of El Paso, Juarez, where I live. So the positive deviant, well, I first also must apologize for not having any slides. I'm going to believe in narrative power because I do like to tell some stories. So the positive deviance approach believes that communities are endowed with the wisdom, the power, and the resources to solve their own problems. And the role of the expert, the outsider, the interventionist, or the change agent is best captured by what Lao Tzu said several thousand years ago. Go to the people, live with them, learn from them, love them, start with what they know, build with what they have, and when the work is done and the task is accomplished, the people will say, we have done this ourselves. Now, the fundamental premise of positive deviance is that no matter what the problem, and no matter how complex the problem, whether it is food insecurity or malnutrition, whether it is low rates of cancer screenings or poor diabetes control, whether it is teenage pregnancy or school dropouts, the positive deviance approach believes that in every community, there exist people who have already solved the problem. And here's the kicker. Not only have they solved the problem, but there exist people who have done so while facing the highest odds and with no extra resources. And you may say, how is that possible? People with no extra resources facing the highest odds have solved the problem. Now, the positive deviance approach says that it is possible for this to happen because of a new way of thinking, a flipped way of thinking, a new way of asking questions that have not been asked before, and a new way of acting. Now, what do we mean by a new way of thinking and acting? So here are my three little narrative power renditions. There's a story of President Abraham Lincoln being asked by a soldier who had met him for the first time and was shaking his hand, "Mr. President, you're tall. How tall are you?" And without batting an eyelid, Lincoln says, "Son, like you, tall enough that my feet reach the ground." Now, that's not the way we typically think. We measure height in feet and inches, but in essence, what Lincoln is saying is that wisdom does not lie with the one who's the tallest, or who's a commander-in-chief, or who is a president, but wisdom is commonly distributed. It's a new way of thinking. When I was 17 years old, I started a correspondence relationship with Mother Teresa, which lasted for a very long time. And there's a beautiful story of Mother Teresa arriving in Washington, D.C., 1974, and being met by 1,000 people at Dulles Airport with placards who said, "Mother, tomorrow we are having a march in Washington against the Vietnam War. Would you march with us?" And Mother said, "My child, if you're going to march against the Vietnam War, I am so sorry. But my child, if you were to choose to have a march in Washington for peace, I will be the first to lead." It's a different way of thinking. What Mother Teresa is telling us is that frames are important. What choices do we make? Usually we are also problem focused. We focus on what's not working. What are we up against? And that's the reason why we begin with deficits and gaps. I think what Mother Teresa is telling us is maybe we should ask different questions. What are we for? What are the assets? What's working? The third story, which again constitutes the philosophical tenet of the positive deviance approach, comes from India, country where I was born. Mahatma Gandhi, who always traveled by third class in a train, was often asked by his fellow Indians, Bapu means father, "Father, why do you travel third class? We as a country can do better. You're the father of the Indian nation." And his response was always the same. He would say, "I travel third class because, as you know, there is no fourth class. I travel third class because, as you know, there is no fourth class." Now, this is a completely different way of thinking and acting. Now, you can take these stories to understand how communities hold the power to solve the problem. So I'll give you a very concrete example. In the 1990s, early 1990s, positive deviance pioneers, Jerry and Monique Sternen, arrived in Vietnam to address a very big problem. 65% of the kids under the age of 5 in the country were severely malnourished. Jerry and Monique Sternen asked a very different question. And you'll see how the thinking of Abe Lincoln, Ma Teresa, and Mahatma Gandhi come into play. The question was simply, are there children from very, 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 very poor households who are well nourished? Now, this is an implausible question, an improbable question, because we live in probabilistic worlds. Almost an impossible question. No regression equation can be written which will ask this question. Now, guess what? They began work in 4 communities with 3,000 kids under the age of 5, and they found a few dozen, less than 1%, who came from very, very poor families and who were well nourished, which basically means that the wisdom to solve malnutrition and to access food security already lies with these 24 kids and their caretakers. And they are deviants because they're not the norm. They're only less than 1%. They're positive because they have solved the problem. And that's where you get the terminology of the positive deviance approach. It's a data-driven approach that allows you to figure out what's working and what's working for those for whom it shouldn't be working. So now you've got to dig. What the heck are these people doing that others are not doing? And as they dug for wisdom, they unearthed the following, that some mothers were using sweet potato shoots, the greens of sweet potato plants, and adding them to the pulp. Now, this resource was accessible to all, but it wasn't the norm. Some mothers were actively feeding their children so that no food was wasted, which wasn't the norm. Children were left to eat on their own. And some mothers were taking meals, breaking it into smaller portions, and instead of feeding them twice a day, we're feeding them 3 or 4 times a day, smaller meals, and that led to better assimilation. Now, the natural inclination is to, once you figure out these nuggets of wisdom, is to tell people about them. And here, positive deviance, this approach, does another flip. It believes not in telling people, it believes not in showing people, but it believes in creating the conditions for people to act out these newly discovered but uncommon behaviors. So cooking sessions were conducted where mothers were asked to forage for sweet potato, greens, and little tiny shrimps and crabs. They came, they cooked, they actively fed their kids, they tracked the kids' progress. And cut a long story short, this story is very well documented. 85% of the kids in Vietnam who were malnourished within a span of 5 years. So basically, the communities in Vietnam had solved their problem through their own wisdom and through their own resources. I'll end with Robert Frost. Always end with Robert Frost, you can never go wrong, who said, we dance around a ring and suppose the truth sits in the middle and knows. Thank you.